Laramie Basin, Wyoming Territory, October 1879. While his neighbors prepared their log cabins for winter in the traditional way, replacing dried clay chinking, banking earth against foundations, and checking window shutters, a Norwegian immigrant named Lars Vikstrom was doing something no one in the territory had ever seen. He was digging a ditch, not a shallow drainage ditch, and not a pit for a root cellar or a water well. He was burying a long wooden pipe, a pipe that seemed to lead nowhere out in the open prairie, ending right in the middle of his cabin floor. A pipe that, according to every experienced builder within 50 miles, would do absolutely nothing except fill his home with freezing draft, air, and prairie dirt. They laughed at him openly. They called it Vikstrom's Folly. They told him he would freeze to death come January, and that it would serve him right for ignoring decades of frontier common sense. What Lars Vikstrom understood about ground thermal mass, soil insulation, and air convection would save his family's lives during the brutal freeze of 1880. It would transform how frontier cabins managed indoor climate for the next 40 years, proving that the most powerful heating system on the American frontier was sitting 6 feet underground all along. Picture this. Outside, an Arctic freeze stalled over the Wyoming plains, pushing temperatures down to -18 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 straight days. In standard log cabins across the basin, families were burning 4 days of hard-won firewood in a single night just to keep the far corners of their living rooms at 32 degrees. Drafts dragged icy air across floorboards like frozen rivers. Inside Vikstrom's cabin, the floor register blew a steady, draft-free current of air pre-warmed to 50 degrees Fahrenheit by the earth itself. His indoor thermometer read a comfortable 64 degrees Fahrenheit. His firebox consumed less than half the wood his neighbors burned, and his children slept without heavy coats. Before we revealed the simple physics behind this brilliant earth tube system and how it silenced every critic in the territory, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below letting me know where you are watching from and what the temperature is like in your corner of the world right now. Because this story proves that true survival wisdom is often buried right beneath our feet, waiting for someone humble enough to pay attention. The ridicule began the moment Lars broke ground on the 14th of October, 1879. A heavy morning frost had already killed off the late squash vines, and every homesteader in the Laramie Basin knew what that meant. Wyoming winters did not negotiate. You prepared your shelter correctly, or you suffered through months of misery. Sometimes, you died. Lars Vikstrom had arrived in the territory just 2 years earlier, in 1877. He spoke broken English and carried traditional Scandinavian building concepts that most of his American neighbors had never encountered. He had constructed his primary cabin using local methods, horizontal pine logs, a riverstone foundation, and mud mixed with dried prairie moss for chinking. But now, as winter approached, he was deviating in a way that seemed downright irrational to everyone watching. He was digging a trench 4 to 6 feet deep, sloping gently upward from an open point 60 feet south of his cabin, running in a straight line directly toward his southern foundation wall. Thomas Bradley, a veteran carpenter who had raised 17 cabins across 3 western territories, stopped by on the 3rd day of excavation. He stood on the edge of the dirt mound, watching Lars haul another heavy basket of rocky Wyoming soil to the surface, and slowly shook his head. "You planning to pipe creek water all the way up here, Lars?" Bradley asked, though he already knew the creek sat a quarter mile to the west. "Air," Lars replied simply, without stopping his shovel. Bradley burst into laughter. It was not a cruel laugh, just the confident amusement of a man who believed his 30 years of frontier carpentry had taught him everything worth knowing. "Air comes through the door, cracks for free, son. You are wasting daylight you ought to be using to chop firewood." What Bradley failed to grasp was that Lars was not piping air directly into his cabin from the surface. He was forcing that air to take a long, slow journey through the deep thermal mass of the earth first. Over the next week, while his neighbors finished cutting pine logs and stocking their woodpiles, Lars lined the bottom of his trench with flat sandstone slabs, creating a uniform channel 8 inches wide and 6 inches tall. Then he laid a continuous line of hollowed-out cottonwood logs, end to end. He had crafted these pipes himself, Each log segment fitted tightly into the next, sealed at every joint with thick pine pitch to prevent soil moisture or dirt from leaking inside. The completed pipe ran from a screened intake box, situated 60 feet south of the home, angled slightly downward into the earth until it reached its maximum depth of 6 feet below the surface. From there, it gradually rose upward until it passed directly through the stone foundation wall, terminating at a wooden floor register built into the cabin floorboards, positioned 3 feet from the corner fireplace. Sarah Lindholm, a neighbor whose husband had tragically frozen to death during a sudden blizzard the previous winter in an ill-built cabin, brought Lars a pot of warm coffee on the morning he sealed the final wooden joint. She was genuinely frightened for his family's safety. "Lars, honey," she said, leaning over the trench, "that pipe is going to pull nothing but Arctic frost and ice right up through your floorboards all winter long. You have 2 small babies in that house. Please, fill that ditch in and seal up that floor hole before the snow hits." Lars accepted the coffee, smiled patiently, and looked up at her. "The earth is not cold like the wind, Mrs. Lindholm. 6 feet down, she is always warm. She is always the same." Sarah did not understand. No one in the basin did. In their minds, underground meant cold, damp, and dangerous. The earth was a place where you buried the dead or stored winter potatoes because nothing living could survive down there. What they did not realize was that Lars came from a region in Norway where builders had spent centuries utilizing ground thermal mass. They understood that the earth acts as an immense thermal sponge, absorbing summer heat and holding on to it deep underground throughout the dark winter months. By the 1st of November, Lars had completely backfilled the 60-foot trench, packed the soil solid, and smoothed the surface so well that visitors could hardly tell where the earth had been disturbed. All that remained visible on the surface was a small, wire-screened wooden intake box located 60 feet south of the home, protected by a wooden rain hood and the small wooden floor register inside the living room. To his neighbors, those 2 small openings were nothing more than monuments to wasted labor and Scandinavian stubbornness. Thomas Bradley made a public prediction at the local general store that week that everyone would remember later that winter. "Come February," he declared, "Vikstrom is going to be stuffing frozen mud into that floor hole and cursing his own foolishness." Bradley was half right about the cursing, but it would not be Lars doing it. The physical principle Lars Vikstrom was utilizing is known in modern building science as geothermal gradient stabilization or ground-coupled passive ventilation. Below the local frost line, that critical soil depth where seasonal surface temperature swings cease to penetrate the earth, maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round. In the Laramie Basin, at a depth of 4 to 6 feet, the deep soil temperature held steady between 50 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of whether the air on the surface was baking at 90 degrees in July or plunging to 20 below zero in January. Lars's buried wooden pipe was functioning as a passive geothermal heat exchanger, using 60 feet of Wyoming soil as a thermal battery. Think about how this system operated when winter arrived. Cold, dry, oxygen-rich surface air entered the southern intake box out in the yard. As the cabin's central fireplace burned, warm air rose up the chimney, creating a natural low-pressure draft inside the home. This draft pulled fresh air through the buried pipe system. As that freezing surface air traveled through 60 feet of buried wooden pipe surrounded by soil that refused to freeze, a massive heat exchange occurred. Cold air moving through the pipe absorbed heat from the warm pipe walls. The surrounding earth, possessing almost infinite thermal inertia, transferred its stored energy into the air current without suffering any measurable drop in temperature itself. By the time that outside air emerged through the wooden floor register inside the cabin, it had been preconditioned from sub-zero surface temperatures up to approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit. To a human being standing in a room, 50 degrees might feel cool, but compared to sub-zero surface air, it was a massive thermodynamic victory. Air arriving through Lars's floor register was 40 to 60 degrees warmer than the outside air entering neighboring cabins through wall cracks. Even more importantly, it arrived without the violent, bone-chilling drafts that plagued standard log homes. In a conventional cabin, A roaring fireplace acts like a giant vacuum. It needs oxygen to feed combustion, so it sucks outside air into the room through every available gap under door frames, around window shutters, and through dried clay chinking. That air arrives at full exterior freezing temperature, dropping to the floorboards and creating freezing drafts that sweep across the living space, chilling feet and pulling heat out of human bodies no matter how big the fire burns. In Lars's home, the fireplace drew its combustion air directly from the floor register. The fresh air entering the home was already 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The cabin's interior air pressure remained balanced, completely stopping the cold infiltration drafts that plagued every other home in the basin. Explaining this invisible air exchange to frontier settlers who built purely by visual habit was nearly impossible. "You are trying to tell me that plain dirt makes cold air warm?" John Hutchkins, the settlement's blacksmith, asked as he inspected the floor register in mid-November. "Lars, I respect a hard-working man, but that goes against common sense." Lars took Hutchkins by the arm and walked him outside to the screened intake box 60 feet south of the cabin. He had the blacksmith place his bare hand over the intake screen, feeling the cold surface air being pulled down into the ground by the cabin's chimney draft. Then Lars led him back inside the warm cabin and had him place his hand directly over the open floor register. The air flowing upward against his palm was warm, unmistakably warmer than the air outside. "It is a trick of the fireplace," Hutchkins concluded after a long pause. "Heat from your hearth is radiating down through the floorboards and warming the pipe." It was not. Lars had intentionally positioned the floor register 8 feet away from the fireplace's radiant heat zone. But Hutchkins had already made up his mind. The physical reality unfolding right in front of his eyes did not fit his mental model of how the world worked. The resistance Lars encountered was not born out of malice or stupidity. It was the invisible barrier of assumed frontier knowledge. Every settler in Wyoming knew from personal experience that bringing outside air into a cabin made the room colder. That was an observable, repeated fact. You opened a door, and cold air rushed in. You had a gap in your chinking, and your water bucket froze solid overnight. To suggest that you could deliberately dig a hole to the outside, pull air into your living room, and have that air arrive warmer defied everything they had seen with their own eyes. It required accepting that an invisible force earth temperature 6 feet underground mattered far more than the surface weather they felt against their faces every day. Thomas Bradley's critique was more technical, and therefore more influential among the neighbors. He considered himself the master builder of the territory, and experts rarely enjoy being shown a better way by an immigrant who speaks broken English. "I have raised 17 cabins in these mountains," Bradley told a crowd at the blacksmith shop. "Not one of them needed a buried wooden tube to stay livable. You know what a proper cabin needs? 3 inches of horsehair mortar chinking, earth banked 4 feet high against the foundation logs, and a stone firebox that does not waste heat up the flue. Mark my words, that pipe is going to fill up with condensation moisture, freeze solid by Christmas, and crack wide open. Then he will have a 6-foot ditch delivering ice water straight into his living room." Bradley's prediction sounded completely logical. In a poorly designed system, warm, moist air meeting cold pipe walls does indeed produce heavy condensation that can freeze and block airflow. What Bradley did not know was that Lars had already calculated the moisture dynamics. He had sloped the 60-foot pipe gently downward toward the southern intake box, ensuring that any minor condensation that formed inside would naturally drain outward into the soil, away from the cabin foundation. Furthermore, cottonwood logs are slightly porous, allowing micromoisture to absorb harmlessly into the wood fibers without pooling or forming ice dams. None of these engineering nuances mattered to the court of public opinion. By late November, Vikstrom's buried pipe was the favorite joke at the trading post. Even kindly neighbors who brought the Vikstrom family quarters of venison viewed the system as an eccentric waste of energy. "Let him learn his lesson," Sarah Lindholm's husband remarked one evening. "Some lessons can only be taught by a Wyoming winter." Winter heard the challenge, and it was preparing a lesson that no one in Laramie Basin would ever forget. December arrived in 1879, with cold that was manageable by Wyoming standards. Daytime temperatures hovered in the teens, while nighttime lows occasionally touched 0. It was standard frontier winter weather. Fireplaces roared across the basin. Families slept under stacks of wool quilts, and life moved along its usual winter rhythm. During those early weeks of December, Lars's buried wooden pipe performed quietly, efficiently, and without a single glitch. While his neighbors were burning through their first major piles of split pine wood to combat invisible wall drafts, Lars's floor register was continuously supplying his living room with pre-warmed air. Because his fireplace drew its combustion air from the earth pipe, rather than sucking cold air through wall seams, the interior atmosphere of his cabin remained remarkably still, draft-free, and comfortable. Yet no one in the basin noticed the difference during December. A few degrees of improved fuel efficiency does not announce itself in mild cold weather. The neighbors saw wood smoke rising from Lars's chimney, just like any other house, and they assumed his buried pipe was sitting useless under the frozen dirt. Then came January of 1880, and with it, an Arctic nightmare. A massive polar air mass, what meteorologists today recognize as a rare Arctic outbreak, descended from northern Canada, dropping onto the high plains of Wyoming like a lead weight on the 8th of January. By the 10th of January, the surface temperature across the Laramie Basin had not risen above zero in 48 hours. By the night of the 12th of January, the mercury plummeted to -18 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by a biting, continuous wind. And there it stayed, locked in place for 6 straight days. Settler journals from that winter refer to those terrifying 6 days as the frozen week. It was a sustained deep freeze that killed cattle in their pens, froze deep stone wells solid to the bottom, and tested every single timber structure in the territory to its absolute physical limits. Inside standard log cabins across the basin, the struggle for survival turned desperate overnight. Because a burning firebox creates strong air suction, every fireplace in the valley began dragging freezing surface air into the cabins through every microscopic crack in the clay, chinking around door frames, and through roof vents. That air arrived at -18 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping straight to the floorboards and forming invisible currents of ice-cold air that swept across the rooms. Thomas Bradley's family huddled within 3 feet of their stone hearth, wrapped in every wool blanket and buffalo robe they owned. 10 feet away, near the center table, the indoor temperature sat at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. In the far corners of the cabin, water cups froze solid, and frost formed thick white patterns along the inner timber walls. Bradley was forced to feed his firebox every 45 minutes around the clock. He burned through 4 days' worth of split firewood in a single night. Yet despite the roaring flames, his wife woke up on the 3rd morning with frost clinging to her hair. Sarah Lindholm's cabin suffered an even worse fate. A structural gap where her roof beams met the top wall log, a gap hidden from view, became a channel for sub-zero air. The freezing draft poured down the back wall, dropping the room temperature so fast that her firewood supply vanished in 3 days. On the 4th night of the freeze, facing empty wood racks and freezing children, Sarah was forced to chop up her own furniture first. A wooden rocking chair, then a pine kitchen table, just to keep her children warm through the dark hours before dawn. Across the entire Laramie Basin, the pattern repeated itself. Families were burning through fuel at an impossible rate, shivering in heavy coats inside their own living rooms, and desperately counting the hours until the Arctic storm broke. And then there was the Vikstrom cabin. On the morning of the 13th of January, the 5th day of the extreme freeze, Lars Vikstrom woke up, stepped out of bed in his wool socks, and checked his home. The indoor air temperature sat at a steady, comfortable 61 degrees Fahrenheit. His fireplace had burned down to warm coals overnight, yet the room remained warm. His 2 small children slept under a single blanket, completely unbothered by the Arctic gale raging outside. His wife was preparing bread dough on the kitchen table. The buried wooden pipe was operating at peak efficiency, while the surface world above was freezing at -18 degrees Fahrenheit. The soil 6 feet underground held at its constant 50 degrees. As surface air was pulled through 60 feet of buried log pipe, it absorbed the Earth's stored energy, emerging through the floor register at roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This pre-warmed air fed the fireplace, supplied fresh oxygen for combustion, and replenished the cabin's atmosphere without creating a single cold draft. Lars's firebox consumed roughly half the firewood his neighbors burned, yet maintained a far superior indoor temperature because it was not constantly fighting an influx of sub-zero surface air. Lars did not brag. He did not walk out into the snow to gloat. He simply maintained his small fire, kept his family warm, and waited for the weather to break. On the afternoon of the 14th of January, Thomas Bradley, desperate to understand why his own woodpile was disappearing so fast while his house remained freezing, walked out into the snow to inspect his neighbor's chimneys. He looked across the basin and saw thick, dark plumes of smoke spewing frantically from every cabin roof fires burning at maximum capacity, consuming fuel like paper. Then he looked at Lars Vikstrom's chimney. Rising from Lars's roof was a thin, steady thread of light gray smoke, the signature of a small, controlled maintenance fire. Bradley stood knee-deep in the snow at 18 below zero, staring at that thin column of smoke, and felt his absolute certainty shatter. Something was fundamentally different inside that cabin. The only difference was the buried pipe he had called a useless folly. On the evening of the 15th of January, 6 days into the freeze, Thomas Bradley walked up the snowpath and knocked on Lars Vikstrom's door. He came with his hat in his hand, completely stripped of his former pride. "Lars," he said softly, "I need to see your house." When Bradley stepped across the threshold, the physical contrast was overwhelming. He had just left his own cabin, where his breath fogged visibly 6 feet from the hearth. Inside Lars's home, the air felt like a mild autumn afternoon, cool, comfortable, and completely still. His frozen fingers began to ache as the blood returned to them. Bradley walked around the room in silence, touching the walls, feeling the floorboards, and standing over the floor register. Warm, steady air was flowing upward against his boots. "Where is your thermometer, Lars?" Bradley asked. Lars pulled a mercury laboratory thermometer from a shelf, a tool his wife had borrowed from the trading post storekeeper. "This morning, before I lit the morning wood, it read 58 degrees, Lars said. Now, with a small fire burning, it holds at 64 degrees. Bradley did the math in his head, and the numbers were staggering. Outside temperature, minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside temperature, plus 64 degrees Fahrenheit. That was an 82-degree temperature difference, maintained with half the firewood he was burning in his own home. "Show me the pipe again," Bradley said quietly. They walked out into the freezing air, and Lars traced the buried 60-foot line across the snow, explaining the required depth below the frost line, the stone-lined channel, and the gentle drainage slope. Bradley knelt at the southern intake box, placed his bare hand over the screen, and felt sub-zero air being drawn down into the earth. He realized the simple, undeniable truth. The 60-foot buried pipe was using the massive thermal inertia of the deep earth as a preheating tank. "Son of a gun," Bradley whispered, shaking his head. "You are using the deep ground to warm your air before it ever touches your firebox." "Yes," Lars said simply. "The earth does not freeze deep down. She shares her warmth with the air that passes through her." Thomas Bradley was experiencing something rare on the frontier. The realization that his 30 years of building experience had a massive blind spot, and that his arrogance had cost his family days of suffering and cords of wasted wood. Over the next 2 days, as the Arctic air mass finally began to retreat, Bradley conducted a careful, methodical comparison between Lars's fuel consumption and his own. The results were irrefutable. To maintain an indoor temperature of 52 degrees near his hearth and 30 degrees in the corners, Bradley's cabin consumed 19 split pine logs per day. To maintain a uniform indoor temperature of 64 degrees throughout the entire living space, Lars's cabin consumed 10 split pine logs per day. Lars achieved a superior, draft-free indoor climate while burning 47% less firewood. More important than fuel savings was thermal stability. Bradley's home suffered wild temperature swings depending on wind gusts and fire intensity. Lars's home held a steady temperature because the air entering his floor register was preconditioned by the deep soil, completely isolated from surface weather violence. On the 17th of January, Sarah Lindholm visited the Vikstrom home after the temperature climbed back above zero. Lars had her place her bare hand over the floor register. Feel the air moving upward, noticeably warmer than the cold surface wind outside. Sarah looked at Lars, her eyes filling with tears. She was thinking about the wooden chairs she had chopped up for fuel, the terrifying nights her children had shivered under wool coats, and the simple, elegant solution that had been sitting right under her feet all along. "Could this system work for my cabin, Lars?" she asked softly. Lars looked out toward her south-facing yard, mentally calculating the required distance, soil depth, and slope. "Yes, Mrs. Lindholm," he said gently. "If we dig 4 feet deep and give the pipe 60 feet of length, the earth will warm your air just the same." By the 20th of January, 7 different homesteaders had visited the Vikstrom cabin to inspect the floor register and trace the buried pipeline. By the 25th of January, Thomas Bradley returned not to argue, but to ask detailed engineering questions about pipe diameter, slope ratios, and optimal cottonwood log joints. The useless pipe had officially rewritten the rules of frontier heating efficiency in the Wyoming territory. The deep physics operating inside Lars Vikstrom's earth tube are recognized today as ground-coupled heat exchange or earth-air heat exchangers. Here is what was happening. 6 feet underground. At a depth of 4 to 6 feet below the surface, soil temperature remains completely unaffected by daily or weekly weather events. The Earth possesses immense thermal mass, meaning its temperature changes extremely slowly over months rather than hours. When cold, dense surface air entered the southern intake box at -18 degrees Fahrenheit, it was forced through 60 feet of narrow wooden pipe, completely surrounded by soil holding at 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Thermal transfer occurred through conduction. The cold air absorbed energy directly from the inner pipe walls. Because the mass of the surrounding earth was so vast, the heat drawn by the airstream did not lower the soil temperature in any measurable way. Furthermore, the gentle upward slope of the pipe prevented moisture accumulation. As cold surface air warmed inside the pipe, its relative humidity dropped, preventing condensation from pooling inside the line. Finally, the system created a balanced pressure loop inside the home. In a standard cabin, the fireplace acts as an exhaust fan, creating negative indoor air pressure that pulls cold air through every wall seam. In Lars's home, the buried pipe provided a dedicated, low-resistance path for combustion air, balancing indoor pressure and completely eliminating wall drafts. It was an interconnected system of geothermal energy, air pressure balancing, and thermal conduction built out of hollowed cottonwood logs, flat field stones, and pine pitch by a man who simply understood how the earth works. By February of 1880, the Laramie Basin settlement had split into 2 distinct groups: those who had physically visited Lars Vikstrom's cabin during the freeze, and those who had only heard rumors about it. The settlers who had stood over that floor register could not stop talking. Thomas Bradley became an unlikely evangelist for the system. The very man who had publicly mocked the buried pipe as Vikstrom's Folly was now drawing diagrams in the dirt outside the trading post, explaining soil insulation and geothermal stability to anyone who would listen. "It is not magic," Bradley would tell skeptical newcomers, embarrassed by his earlier arrogance. "It is just basic physics that we were too stubborn to pay attention to. The Earth does not freeze past a certain depth. Never has, never will. You run cold air through that stable ground zone, and it comes out warm. It is as simple as that." System adoption spread rapidly across the basin, though putting the theory into practice required hard physical work. The first settler to replicate the system was Jacob Morrison, whose cabin sat on a gentle, south-facing slope that offered ideal terrain for a buried intake line. Morrison began digging on the 8th of February, 1880, following Lars's specifications as closely as frontier tools allowed. A 60-foot trench, dug 4 to 6 feet deep, sloped for drainage, and lined with field stones where possible. Morrison's soil contained more gravel than Lars's, making digging easier but requiring more careful pipe sealing. He used hollowed pine logs instead of cottonwood, sealing the tight joints with a heated mixture of pine pitch and rendered animal tallow. The excavation took 11 days of backbreaking labor. When Morrison opened his floor register on the 20th of February, the results were immediate. While his intake line was 10 feet shorter due to a buried rock ledge he could not cut through, his cabin held a steady indoor temperature of 58 degrees Fahrenheit while consuming roughly 60% of his normal wood supply. Word of Morrison's success spread far beyond the immediate valley. Sarah Lindholm, determined never again to burn her kitchen furniture to keep her children warm, hired 2 homesteaders to dig an intake trench for her cabin in March, before the spring thaw turned the soil to thick mud. Her installation presented unique challenges. Her soil was heavy clay that required iron picks, and her stone foundation sat lower than ideal. The crew adapted by extending her intake pipe to 75 feet in length to achieve the proper deep earth depth, using kyline-fired clay drain pipes purchased from a brickworks in Cheyenne. The clay pipe segments were expensive, costing her $22, a substantial sum for a widow on the frontier, but the clay was permanent, water-sealed, and immune to rot. Her investment paid off immediately. When the first snows returned the following December, her children slept warm and comfortable for the first time since their father's death. By late 1880, 11 individual cabins within a 40-mile radius of Laramie had installed earth-coupled intake pipes. The design adaptations were fascinating. The Anderson family utilized a 60-foot copper pipe salvaged from an abandoned mining pump, achieving superior thermal conductivity. Henrik Olivesen, another Norwegian settler, expanded the concept by burying a secondary pipeline for summer cooling, pulling hot prairie air through the deep soil to cool his cabin during July heat waves. A group of 3 Swedish immigrant families in the northern part of the Basin pooled their labor to dig a shared central intake line that fed 3 neighboring cabins from a single deep earth trench. Not every early installation succeeded. 2 homesteaders attempted to shortcut the depth requirement by burying their pipes only 2 feet down. Their systems failed because the Wyoming frost line penetrated 30 inches into the ground, leaving their shallow pipes sitting in the freezing temperature zone. Another builder used unseasoned green timber for his pipe logs, which warped and cracked within months, allowing cold dirt and water to block the airflow. The successful builders shared 3 strict principles: buried depth below the local frost line, a minimum of 60 feet of pipe length for heat exchange, and a sloped, pitch-sealed line to prevent water pooling. By 1882, earth pipes were so common in the region that land agents advising new settlers arriving in the Wyoming Territory routinely gave them a simple piece of advice: dig your air intake trench before you finish laying your house logs. Thomas Bradley did not stop at simply copying Lars's design. He innovated. In the spring of 1881, Bradley designed a dual-purpose ventilation system that served as an earth-warmed air intake during the winter and a root cellar cooling duct during the summer. By adding a simple wooden flap valve inside the pipe junction, Bradley could redirect 50-degree air into his living room during cold months, or route that same stable air across his stored potatoes and salt pork in his root cellar during hot months, dramatically extending his food preservation time. By 1883, 17 homes in the county had adopted Bradley's dual-valve modification. Lars Vikstrom never charged a single penny for his knowledge. He walked miles across the prairie to help neighbors calculate pipe slopes, inspect soil depth, and seal cottonwood log joints. When settlers thanked him for saving their wood piles, he simply brushed it off. In Norway, he would say, "We share the knowledge that keeps us alive. It should be no different here." The buried intake technique spread far beyond the borders of Wyoming. Mountain trappers carried descriptions of Vikstrom's Folly north into Montana. A Swedish family moving east to Minnesota described the earth pipe system in letters home, sparking a wave of earth-coupled ventilation builds among Scandinavian homesteads across the northern plains. By 1885, regional agricultural journals were publishing technical diagrams describing what they called the Vikstrom method of ground-coupled ventilation. Engineers began testing variations, measuring airflow velocity, and documenting the exact relationship between burial depth, pipe surface area, and indoor temperature gain. What had started as one man's mocked project had transformed into a recognized frontier building standard, not through government mandates or academic authority, but through the irrefutable proof of families sleeping warm while burning half the firewood The story of Lars Vikstrom's buried air pipe might seem like a distant 19th century artifact, an ingenious frontier hack that was eventually made obsolete by modern central heating systems and electricity. But history has a funny way of coming full circle. By the 1920s, as rural electrification spread and oil furnaces replaced wood stoves, earth pipe systems fell out of common use. Homeowners preferred the push-button convenience of oil burners that required no digging, no log carving, and no trench maintenance. Convenience won out over efficiency, as it so often does. The knowledge went dormant for 50 years, preserved only in old frontier journals, regional history archives, and the memories of elderly homesteaders. Then came the global energy crisis of the 1970s. Fuel prices skyrocketed, heating bills surged, and modern architects began searching frantically for passive, low-energy ways to heat and cool buildings without relying entirely on fossil fuels. In their search for answers, building engineers rediscovered ground-coupled ventilation. They gave it sleek, modern names: earth tubes, ground-source heat exchangers, and geothermal ventilation loops. Patents were filed, academic research papers were published, and the technology was hailed by national media as a cutting-edge breakthrough in green engineering. Exactly 0 people in the mainstream engineering community realized they were simply reinventing what a Norwegian immigrant had built with a hand chisel and hollow cottonwood logs in 1879. Today, advanced earth tube systems are installed in high-performance passive solar homes, certified sustainable buildings, and off-grid homesteads around the world. Modern builders use corrugated plastic pipes, mechanical ventilation fans, and antimicrobial interior coatings, but the core thermodynamic principle remains completely identical to Lars Vikstrom's 1880 design. Subsurface air passing through soil below the frost line naturally equilibrates toward the stable year-round temperature of the deep earth. Modern earth tube installations routinely achieve incredible performance metrics, moderating incoming air by up to 25 degrees Fahrenheit, reducing conventional heating loads by 50 to 70%, and providing free, draft-free ventilation year-round. The ultimate lesson of Vikstrom's Folly is not about pipes, logs, or trenches. It is about the danger of human certainty. When Thomas Bradley stood on the edge of Lars's trench in 1879 and laughed at his buried pipe, he was not being malicious. He was simply certain. He was certain that his 17 cabins worth of experience had taught him everything worth knowing. He was certain that traditional methods were the only right methods. He was certain that a foreign immigrant with broken English could not possibly understand something he had missed. His unexamined certainty cost his family days of shivering in 6-foot drafts and cords of wasted firewood. The exact same pattern repeats throughout human history. Traditional wisdom is dismissed as primitive, foreign techniques are ignored as foolish, and nature's subtle laws are overlooked until a crisis forces us to re-examine what we thought we knew. The deep soil, 6 feet below our feet, holds at a steady 50 degrees Fahrenheit, whether we believe in it or not. Whether you are a 19th century Norwegian homesteader digging a trench with a spade in 1879, or a modern engineer designing a sustainable home in the 21st century, the laws of physics do not change. Only our willingness to learn from them changes. Lars Vikstrom passed away in 1904, 24 years after the frozen week that proved his system worked. His original log cabin, complete with its buried cottonwood air pipe, stood until 1937, when it was finally taken down to make way for a modern framed house. The new owners never reconnected the earth tube. They installed an oil furnace instead. Their monthly heating bills that first winter were higher than Lars had ever spent in fuel during his entire life. The difference was that their waste was hidden in a monthly utility bill rather than an empty woodpile. Progress had traded physical efficiency for mechanical convenience. The Earth 6 feet down is still holding at 50 degrees Fahrenheit today, completely unaffected by surface blizzards or summer heat waves. It remains ready to share that thermal stability with anyone humble enough to dig a trench, seal a pipe, and let the laws of physics do the work. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized historical reconstructions, while the building techniques, thermodynamic concepts, and structural principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current local building codes, safety guidelines, and applicable regulations.